The auctioneer's voice, a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence, echoed off the corrugated steel of the machine shed and rolled across the flattened November corn stubble. It was the sound of a man's dream being dismantled, piece by piece, sold off to the highest bidder under a sky the color of slate. This was Dale Strickland's farm, or what was left of it. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, damp earth, and the cheap cigars of men who came to watch a neighbor fall. At the center of it all, like a monument to a failed ambition, sat the combine. A massive international harvester, 1480 axial flow, its red paint still holding a decent shine, the glass on the cab clean enough to reflect the grim faces of the crowd. It was barely 3 years old, a technological marvel with a price tag that could have bought a whole farm just a generation ago. This was the main event, the prize everyone had come to see. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn canvas jacket. My name is Elias Vance. My own farm, 160 acres of black dirt my grandfather broke with a team of mules, was 5 miles down the road. It was paid for, every last inch, a fact that seemed to make me an outcast in these modern times. My knuckles were scarred and permanently stained with the ghost of grease, a map of countless hours spent keeping old iron alive. A heavy hand clapped my shoulder, and the scent of expensive aftershave cut through the farm air. "Figured I'd see you here, Elias," a booming voice said. "Come to see what a real piece of equipment looks like." It was Franklin Bishop. Frank. He was everything I wasn't. His farm was a sprawling empire of rented and recently purchased land, all financed by the friendly folks at the Farmers Trust Bank. His hands were soft, his boots were clean, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. He stood there in a new insulated vest, looking not at me, but at the 1480 combine, the way a wolf looks at a prize ram. "Just watching, Frank," I said, my voice low. "Watching is all a man can do when he's trying to farm with museum pieces," he chuckled, loud enough for the men around us to hear. A few of them snickered. They all knew about my machinery. My main tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, the one with the classic synchro-range transmission, not the fancy power shift. My planter was an old John Deere 7000, and for harvest I ran a Massey Ferguson 300, a machine that was already considered long in the tooth when I bought it used 10 years ago. They were all paid for. They ran because my 2 hands made them run. "That 4020 of yours must be about ready for the scrap heap, eh?" Frank continued, enjoying his audience. "Bank's got some great rates right now. A man can't make money saving money, Elias. You gotta spend it to make it. Leverage, they call it." I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the auctioneer who was now starting the preamble for the combine. Dale Strickland was standing off to the side, near his wife, looking like a man who'd been hollowed out from the inside. He'd listened to men like Frank. He'd signed the papers. He'd bought the big new machine to keep up, to get bigger. Now the bank was selling it for him. The bidding started. It was fast and furious at first, a flurry of hands and nods from farmers who saw the machine as a shortcut to prosperity. Frank let them wear themselves out. He stood there, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. When the bidding slowed, his hand shot up, his voice clear and confident. He wasn't just buying a combine, he was making a statement. He was crowning himself king of the county. The auctioneer's gavel finally fell, and a murmur went through the crowd. Frank Bishop had just bought the biggest combine in 3 townships for a price that was still staggering, but a bargain compared to new. He turned to me, his chest puffed out. "See that, Elias? That's how you build something. Go big or go home." "It's a fine machine, Frank," I said, and I meant it. "Hope it works out for you." He laughed. "Oh, it'll work out. While you're out there tinkering with that old Massey of yours, I'll be done with my beans in a week. Time is money." He clapped me on the shoulder again and strode off toward the auctioneer's trailer to sign the papers. A pack of other farmers trailing in his wake like pilot fish on a shark. The crowd began to thin out, the main event being over. But I hadn't come for the 1480. My business was in the back, behind the main shed, in the long wet grass where the junk was piled. This was the part of the auction most people ignored, the collection of forgotten, broken and obsolete iron that was sold by the pound for scrap. And there it was. Tucked behind a rusted-out gravity wagon and a set of bent cultivators sat my prize. It was an Alice Chalmers Gleaner F combine. From the looks of it, a 1968 or 69 model. The iconic silver paint was faded and peeling, revealing large patches of deep orange rust. One of the big drive tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split open to the cords. The header was detached, lying in the weeds like a fallen jaw. To anyone else, it was an eyesore, a piece of scrap not even worth the effort of hauling away. To Frank Bishop, it would be a joke, but I saw something else. I saw good bones. I saw a simple, rugged design. I saw a machine that was built before computers and plastic. A machine a man could understand and fix with his own hands. I spent 20 minutes walking around it. I pulled the dipstick on the 262 cubic inch gas engine. The oil was black and thick as tar, but there was no water in it. A good sign. I climbed up the operator's platform. The seat was torn, the foam guts spilling out. But the levers all moved. They were stiff, but they moved. I knew the Gleaner design. The transverse-mounted cylinder and the centerline threshing system were efficient and straightforward. Less complicated than the new rotary designs, but in the right hands, it could still do a clean job. When the auctioneer finally got around to the miscellaneous section, most everyone had gone home. It was just me, a couple of scrap haulers, and a few old-timers who lingered at auctions like it was church. "All right, what am I bid for this old Alice Chalmers combine?" The auctioneer barked, his voice tired. "Let's get it out of here. Who'll give me $100 for scrap?" $100. The scrappers were silent, probably calculating the cost of fuel to haul it versus the price of iron. I raised a single finger. $200, I said. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I got 200. Who'll give 250? Silence. The scrappers shook their heads. It was too much work. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, pointing his gavel at me. "For $200 to Elias Vance." A few of the old-timers shook their heads as I walked up to pay. One of them, a man named George who'd known my father, put a hand on my arm. "Elias," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "What in God's name are you going to do with that thing?" "Gonna get it running, George," I replied, handing the clerk 20 crisp $10 bills from my wallet. "You're better off just pushing it into a ditch," he muttered, walking away. "Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what I was planning, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever seen a man buy something everyone else called junk only to turn it into gold? Let me know down in the comments what it was, because that's the kind of story that builds a country. That's the kind of faith in your own two hands that men like Frank Bishop would never understand. And that pile of rust I just bought for $200 wasn't just a machine. It was a declaration of independence. Getting the Gleaner home was the first battle. I had to come back the next day with my 4020 two hydraulic jacks and a set of heavy chains. The flat tire was so rotten it wouldn't hold air for a second, so I had to chain the axle up, letting the rim drag all the way home. It was a slow, loud 5-mile journey, the screech of steel on asphalt announcing my foolish purchase to every farm I passed. I saw Frank Bishop drive by in his shiny new Ford pickup. He didn't wave. He just slowed down, shook his head with a pitying smirk, and sped off, leaving me in a cloud of dust. I parked the derelict machine behind my barn, out of sight from the road. It looked even worse on my own property, a monument to decay next to my neatly kept, if old, equipment. That winter became the winter of the Gleaner. Every evening, after the chores were done and a quick supper was eaten, I'd pull on my insulated coveralls, turn on the bare bulb hanging in my workshop, and get to work. The first order of business was the engine. It was seized up tight. I pulled the plugs and poured a mixture of automatic transmission fluid and acetone down each cylinder, a concoction the old-timers swore by for breaking loose rusted pistons. I let it sit for a week, the potent smell filling the shop. Then came the hard part. With a 4-foot breaker bar on the front crankshaft bolt, I put my entire weight into it. Nothing. I repositioned, grunted, my muscles straining against decades of rust and neglect. A loud crack echoed in the silent workshop, and for a heart-stopping second I thought I'd snapped the crank. But then it moved. Just a fraction of an inch, a groan of metal protesting its return to life. For the next hour, I worked it back and forth, slowly, patiently, until the crankshaft made a full, glorious rotation. The next 2 months were a blur of methodical, greasy work. I pulled the cylinder head, a heavy chunk of cast iron that took all my strength to lift onto the workbench. The cylinder walls had some light pitting, but nothing a good honing wouldn't clean up. I spent hours with the drill and a ball hone, the tool buzzing rhythmically as I moved it up and down in each cylinder, restoring the crosshatch pattern needed to seat new rings. I took the carburetor apart on a clean cloth on the bench, carefully laying out each tiny jet, spring, and gasket. It was clogged with a foul-smelling varnish from years of old, evaporated gasoline. I soaked it in cleaner for 2 days before meticulously reassembling it. This was the work that separated men from boys. It wasn't glorious. There was no audience, no applause, just the cold bite of steel through worn leather gloves, the stink of solvents, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing a filthy, useless part become clean and functional again. I ordered new gaskets, rings, and bearings from a supplier 2 states away, a man who specialized in parts for obsolete machinery. The parts came in plain brown boxes, no fancy branding, just the promise of new life for old iron. While I was elbow-deep in the engine, the talk at the co-op was reaching a fever pitch. Frank Bishop had become the local celebrity. He'd had the new-to-him 1480 combine completely serviced by the dealer, a bill that was rumored to be in the thousands, and he never missed a chance to talk about its capacity. "That machine will eat 150 acres of corn before lunch," he'd brag, sipping his coffee at the counter. Meanwhile, poor old Elias is out there trying to build a combine out of scrap metal. Some folks just don't know when to quit. One Saturday, he drove his pickup right into my yard. I was in the process of welding a patch onto the grain auger, the brilliant blue light of the arc welder flashing in the dim barn. He killed his engine and walked in, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. "Still at it, I see," he said, gesturing at the disassembled gleaner. I lifted my welding mask, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. "Just about got her, Frank." He kicked at a pile of rusted sheet metal I had cut away. "You know, Elias, there's no shame in getting a loan. It's the modern way. The bank would set you up with a good used machine. Something made in this decade at least." "This one will do just fine," I said, my voice flat. "And it won't come with a payment book." He shook his head, a genuine look of pity on his face. "You're a stubborn man. My father was like that. Proud, died with nothing but a worn-out tractor and 80 acres of debt. This is a new world, Elias. You can't fight it with sentiment and a wrench set." He looked around my shop, at my old drill press, my heavy steel workbench built by my own father, the tools hanging neatly on the wall. "This is all going to be a museum soon." He turned and left without another word. His visit lit a fire in me. The next day, I faced my biggest challenge yet. A key component of the variable speed drive for the cylinder was shattered. It was a complex cast iron pulley, and without it, the combine was useless. I called the parts supplier. He laughed. "Son, they haven't made one of those in 15 years. You'd have better luck finding a hen's tooth." Defeat felt cold and heavy in my gut. Frank's words echoed in my head. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a fool playing with junk. But then I thought of my father, and his father before him, and the way they never, ever gave up on this piece of land. The next morning, I got in my old pickup and drove 80 miles to a salvage yard I'd heard about, a place known as a graveyard for old combines. I spent the entire day in the freezing February mud, climbing over and through the carcasses of rusted machines, my hands numb, my clothes soaked. Just as the sun was setting, casting long, grim shadows across the yard, I found it. Tucked deep in the guts of a Gleaner G, a bigger model, was the pulley. It was intact. After an hour of wrestling with rusted bolts in the fading light, it was mine. I drove home that night, the precious piece of iron sitting on the passenger seat like a holy relic, a testament to the fact that stubbornness, sometimes, was just another word for faith. The first signs of the coming boom were subtle. It was the spring of 1972. The price of a bushel of corn, which had hovered around $1.10 for years, started to creep up. $1.20, $1.30. Then came the news reports, snippets on the radio about a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union. The Great Grain Robbery, some called it. All we knew was that they wanted our corn, our wheat, our soybeans, and they were willing to pay for it. By harvest time that fall, the markets were on fire. Corn was pushing $2 a bushel, and soybeans were even higher. It was like a fever swept through the heartland. The new Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butts, became a folk hero overnight. His message was simple and intoxicating: get big or get out. He told us to plant fence row to fence row, to tear out the windbreaks and drain the sloughs. The world was hungry, he said, and it was the American farmer's job to feed it. And for the first time in a long time, it looked like we were going to get paid handsomely for doing it. For men like Frank Bishop, it was a license to print money. He had the land, he had the big new equipment, and he had the full-throated backing of the Farmers Trust Bank. He farmed his land and Dale Strickland's old farm with ruthless efficiency. His big 1480 combine, followed by a fleet of grain trucks, devoured hundreds of acres in days. The money was rolling in so fast he didn't know what to do with it. So he did what the bank and the government told him to do: he leveraged. He bought another 200 acres from a retiring farmer, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers gasp. He traded the 1480 for a brand-new John Deere 7700, a gleaming green monster with a 6-row corn head. He bought a new 4-wheel drive John Deere 4630 to pull a massive new chisel plow. His success was the talk of the county. He built a new ranch-style house on a hill overlooking his land, with a big picture window and a 2-car garage. His wife drove a new station wagon. Frank held court at the diner every morning, expounding on the new era of farming. He was a prophet of progress. You see, land values are only going one way. Up, he'd declare to anyone who would listen. And grain prices? They're never going back down. The world's population is exploding. This isn't a bubble, it's the new reality. A man would be a fool not to borrow every penny he can get his hands on and buy more land. It's the one thing they're not making any more of. During these conversations, he'd often glance over at me, sitting in my usual booth with my simple cup of black coffee. He saw me as a relic, a cautionary tale. "Take Elias here," he said one morning, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Still puttering around on that little patch his daddy left him. Still running that junk pile combine he built. He's probably making a decent living for him. But he's missing the boat. He's thinking small. In 5 years, guys like me will own this whole county, and guys like him will be working for us, if they're lucky. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was making a decent living. In fact, I was making the best money of my life. The high prices meant my modest yields from my 160 acres were bringing in a small fortune. But our philosophies were night and day. While Frank was pouring his profits and the bank's money into expansion, I was using mine to build a fortress. My Resurrected Gleaner F, which I'd painted a fresh coat of Alice Chalmers silver, performed flawlessly. It was slow, yes. Harvesting took me nearly 3 weeks, while Frank was done in 5 days. I had to work from sunup to sundown, eating sandwiches on the go, stopping only to grease the fittings and refuel. But at the end of each day, I'd shut it down and it would be ready to go the next morning. It asked for nothing but fuel, grease, and a little bit of patience. It didn't have an $800 a month payment attached to its existence. Every check I got from the grain elevator went to one of 2 places. First, I paid off my annual operating loan from the bank within weeks of harvest, something that made my loan officer blink in surprise. Most farmers, even in the good times, carried that debt over. Second, I invested in my own land. I didn't buy more acres, I made my existing acres better. I spent a summer putting in thousands of feet of plastic tile drainage by hand with a rented trencher, a back-breaking job that would improve my yields for decades to come. I built a new, proper machine shed, a sturdy pole building with a concrete floor. I did it myself, with the help of one neighbor, setting every post, raising every truss, and screwing on every sheet of steel. It took me all summer, but it was mine, paid for. To the outside world, to men like Frank, I looked like a man standing still, a man afraid of success. They saw my old 4020, my homemade combine, my modest house. They didn't see the zero balance in my bank file. They didn't see the peace of mind that comes from owning everything you have, free and clear. They saw a failure to launch while I was quietly building a foundation of solid rock. The boom years rolled on, one after another. 1973, 1974. The prices stayed high, the credit stayed loose, and the optimism was infectious. But I started to notice things, small things. The news on the radio in my workshop started talking more and more about inflation. The price of fuel went up, then fertilizer, then seed. The cost of everything was rising, chasing the high price of grain. One evening in the late fall, I was in my shop doing my winter maintenance on the 4020. I had the radio on, tuned to a station out of Des Moines. A man with a serious voice was talking about the Federal Reserve and interest rates. He said the prime rate had just ticked up to 12%. It was just a number, just background noise, as I torqued the bolts on the tractor's manifold. But it stuck with me. The next day, I drove into town to pick up some parts. As I passed the John Deere dealership, I saw Frank Bishop's new pickup parked out front. Through the big plate glass window, I could see him sitting at a salesman's desk, laughing and signing a stack of papers. On the lot outside sat another brand-new piece of equipment, a massive 24-foot disc that must have cost more than my first house. Frank was still buying, still expanding, still racing ahead. But as I watched him sign his name with a confident flourish, I couldn't help but wonder if he'd heard the news on the radio. I wondered if he knew that the easy money, the cheap credit that had built his empire, was quietly coming to an end. As I drove home, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. To the south, I could see the vast expanse of Frank's land, thousands of acres of black fertile soil, all of it belonging, in reality, to the Farmers' Trust Bank. And as I turned into my own lane, I looked over my 160 acres, the fields resting quietly under a blanket of harvested stubble. They weren't much compared to Frank's kingdom, but they were mine. And in the crisp, cold air of the coming winter, I could hear a faint, distant ticking sound, like a clock counting down. A storm was coming, and I wasn't sure anyone else could even see the clouds. The first hint of trouble wasn't a thunderclap, it was a whisper. It came in the summer of 1980, a hot, dry wind that blew relentlessly out of the southwest, day after day, week after week. It was a brassy, searing wind that stole the moisture from the soil and curled the edges of the corn leaves until they looked like brittle grey scrolls. The sky, once a brilliant Midwestern blue, took on a hazy permanent tint of dust. Ponds shrank, their muddy banks cracking into intricate mosaics, and the creeks slowed to a murky trickle. At the co-op, the talk turned from booming prices to the desperate need for rain. Frank Bishop, who had just bought another 100 acres on contract, laughed it off. Just a dry spell, he'd boom, his confidence a little too loud. My new center pivot irrigation system on the home quarter will keep things green. You've got to spend money to make money. But the irrigation system drew from a well that was pulling from the same dropping water table as everyone else's, and the diesel engine that ran the pump drank fuel at a rate that was becoming alarming as oil prices soared. My own corn was suffering. The leaves were curling, and I knew the ears wouldn't fill out properly. But my land, with its years of careful management and the new tile drainage that helped it hold moisture better, was faring better than the overworked, compacted soil on some of Frank's rented ground. My expectations were modest. I didn't need a bumper crop to satisfy a banker. I just needed enough to live on and put some away for next year's seed. The real trouble began at harvest time. The drought had broken yields across the Midwest, but instead of prices going up, they started to slide. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a political move made in a city 1,000 miles away, had slammed the door on our biggest customer. The elevators were full, and the demand had vanished overnight. Corn that had been $3 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch $2.25. It was during this tense, dusty harvest that Frank's empire showed its first real crack. I was finishing up a small field of soybeans near the road with my old gleaner, the silver machine chugging along dependably when I saw it. Frank's massive John Deere 7700 was sitting silent in the middle of one of his biggest fields, a green island in a sea of brown. That was unusual. With Frank's obsession with speed and efficiency, the only time his machine stopped was for fuel or to unload. I finished my pass and drove my old pickup down the road. Frank was standing beside the combine, his hands on his hips, staring at the side of the machine where a complex array of hydraulic lines and electrical wires disappeared behind a panel. He didn't look like the king of the county anymore. He looked tired and angry. "Trouble, Frank," I called out, pulling up beside him. He kicked one of the huge tires. "Thing just quit. Right in the middle of the row. Engine's running fine, but the separator and the header won't engage. Just a blinking red light on the console." I wasn't a stranger to a John Deere, but this new generation was a different beast. I climbed up into the cab. It was like the cockpit of an airplane. Instead of simple, direct levers, there was a panel of rocker switches, warning lights, and a digital tachometer. The air conditioning was still blowing cold air. It was a comfortable way to go broke. "Did you check the fuses?" I asked, stating the obvious. "Of course I checked the fuses," he snapped. "It's one of these damn solenoid valves, I bet. Or a computer board. The dealer's sending a service truck out, but they said it might be tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. I've got 500 acres of beans to cut before the fall rains set in." The service truck did come the next morning. It was a rolling workshop, complete with a crane and a young mechanic in clean overalls who plugged a diagnostic tool into a port under the dashboard. He spent 2 hours running tests before he had an answer. "It's the main hydraulic pump controller," the young man said, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's a sealed unit. We don't repair them, we just replace them. I can have one sent up from Moline, but it'll take 2 days to get here." Frank's face went pale. 2 days? And what's this sealed unit going to cost me? The mechanic looked down at his clipboard, avoiding eye contact. "The part is $2,650, plus shipping, and the labor to install it will be about 4 hours. $3,000. For a part the size of a shoebox." Frank just stood there, speechless. $3,000 and 2 days of perfect harvesting weather lost forever. I saw him look across the field, his eyes landing on my old gleaner as it steadily worked its way through another row of my beans, puffing a little smoke but never faltering. For the first time, the look he gave my old iron wasn't pity or condescension. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. It might have been envy. That winter, the whispers of trouble became a roar. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate battle against runaway inflation, jacked up the prime interest rate. It went from 12% to 15%, then to 18%, then an unthinkable 21%. For farmers like Frank, who had built their operations on massive variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. A loan that was manageable at 8% became an anchor that could drag a battleship to the bottom of the ocean at 20%. The letters started arriving in mailboxes all across the county. They were in plain white envelopes from the Farmers' Trust Bank, but they felt as heavy as tombstones. They spoke in a cold, sterile language of loan covenants, collateral re-evaluation, and immediate repayment demands. The land that had been their greatest asset was now their biggest liability. Land values, which had soared in the 70s, collapsed. Ground that Frank had paid $3,000 an acre for was suddenly worth barely half that. He was upside down on everything. The morning meetings at the diner changed. The confident talk of expansion and new equipment was replaced by hushed, fearful conversations about interest rates and foreclosure notices. Men who had been neighbors their whole lives now avoided each other's eyes, ashamed of the financial ruin they were all facing. Frank Bishop stopped coming altogether. The last time I saw him there, he looked like a ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow, and he just stared into his coffee cup, stirring it long after the sugar had dissolved. My own situation was starkly different. My operating loan for the year, a modest sum for fuel, seed, and fertilizer, was paid off as always. I had no other debt. The low grain prices hurt, but they didn't threaten me. I cut back. We ate more from my wife's garden. I patched my work clothes instead of buying new ones, and I spent even more time in my workshop, keeping my old machinery running. The Gleaner F needed a new set of belts for the thresher. I found them in a dusty catalogue for $37. The 4020 needed a new water pump. I rebuilt it myself with a $15 kit. My cost of operation was a tiny fraction of Frank's. My farm was a small, sturdy lifeboat, while his was a magnificent ocean liner that had hit an iceberg of debt and was taking on water fast. The inevitable came in the fall of 1982. A notice was posted in the paper and on the door of the co-op. The Farmers' Trust Bank was foreclosing on the assets of Bishop Farms. There would be an auction. The date was set for a cold, windy Saturday in November, almost 10 years to the day after Dale Strickland's sale. The morning of the auction was bleak. A low grey sky spat a miserable, freezing drizzle. This time the crowd was different. The mood wasn't predatory, it was somber. The farmers who gathered in Frank's muddy yard looked not at the equipment, but at Frank's new house on the hill, as if they could see their own homes in its place. Every man there knew that Frank's fate could easily be his own. They were there to bear witness, to mourn. Frank stood near the porch with his wife and 2 young children, looking small and defeated in the shadow of the massive machinery he had accumulated. The gleaming John Deere 7700 combine, the 4-wheel drive tractor, the fleet of nearly new trucks and implements. They were all lined up, tagged with lot numbers, waiting to be scattered to the winds. I didn't go to gloat. I went because it felt like the right thing to do, a gesture of respect for a man who, for all his faults, had been a neighbor. I also went because I needed something. My old gravity wagon had finally rusted through, and I knew Frank had a good one. The auctioneer started, his voice lacking its usual fire. It was a grim business, and he knew it. The bidding was slow, hesitant. The bankers were there, their faces hard, bidding on the bigger pieces themselves to protect their investment, ensuring the machines sold for at least what was owed. The 7700 combine, which had cost Frank over $100,000 just a few years before, sold to a corporate farm from out of state for 60 cents on the dollar. Piece by piece, Frank's dream was publicly, brutally dismantled. When they got to the smaller items, I made my bid. It was a solid Kilbros 350 gravity wagon, a good piece of equipment that would last me a lifetime. I got it for a fair price. As I was walking to the clerk's trailer to pay, I passed Frank. He was just standing there, watching it all happen, his face a mask of numb despair. "Frank," I said softly. He turned and his eyes focused on me. There was no animosity left in them, only a deep, hollow sadness. "Hello, Elias," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Come to pick over the bones?" "I came to buy a wagon," I said, "and to say I'm sorry." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You were right. All this time, you were right. I built a house of cards on borrowed money, and you built a fortress out of stone. I called you a fool. Turns out I was the one looking in the mirror." It was the confession of a broken man. There was no satisfaction in hearing it. "You had a vision, Frank," I said. "The times just turned against you." "The times didn't make me sign those papers," he said, shaking his head. "My own pride did that, my own greed." He looked over at his house. "They're taking it all, Elias. The land, the equipment, even the house. We have to be out by the 1st of the month." An idea, sudden and clear, formed in my mind. It was a risk, a departure from my cautious nature, but it felt right. It felt necessary. "Not all of it," I said. The next week I went to the bank. I sat down with the same loan officer who had always been so surprised when I paid off my loans early. I didn't want to talk about Frank's massive farming operation. I wanted to talk about one specific parcel. His original home place, the 80 acres his father had farmed, the piece of ground where his new house stood. It was the heart of his farm, but to the bank it was just one more asset to be liquidated. Because I had no debt and a lifetime of perfect credit, the bank was willing to listen. I used the savings I had carefully accumulated over the good years, the money I had earned with my old gleaner and my paid-for tractors, and I made an offer. It was a fair offer based on the new, lower land values, and the bank, eager to get a bad loan off its books, accepted. I didn't haggle. I didn't try to steal it. I paid what it was worth. A few days later, I drove out to Frank's place. The yard was nearly empty, the big machines gone, leaving only dark, oily patches on the ground. Frank was loading personal belongings into a U-Haul truck. He looked up as I approached, his face weary. "Come to take possession, Elias?" he asked, his voice flat. "I came to talk about our new arrangement," I said, holding out a piece of paper. He took it and read it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read it again, his eyes started to brim with tears. I don't understand," he stammered. "A lease agreement? You're leasing me my own house and the 80 acres for $1 a year. That's the arrangement, I said. The house is yours to live in, as long as you want. You can farm the 80 acres. It's good land. It'll be enough to get you back on your feet. You can pay me back for the land when you're able, if you're able. No interest. He just stared at me, the paper trembling in his hand. But Aj, why? After everything I said. After how I treated you. I looked out over the fields, the same fields I had looked at my whole life. Because this is what neighbors do, I said. We've all got to get through this winter together. Frank Bishop never became a big farmer again, but he did get back on his feet. He farmed that 80 acres with a fierce determination I'd never seen in him before. He bought a small used tractor and some older equipment at other auctions, and I helped him keep it running. His hands, once soft, became calloused and stained with grease. He became a better farmer on those 80 acres than he ever was on 2,000. He and his family stayed in that house, and over the years he paid me back for every penny I'd spent on the land. The farm crisis changed our community forever. It washed away the arrogance and the easy credit, and it left behind a hard-won wisdom. Men started talking about sustainability instead of expansion. They started coming to my workshop, hats in hand, asking for help fixing a broken part on an old machine they'd pulled out of the weeds. My old iron, once a symbol of stubborn foolishness, had become a symbol of survival. I was no longer an outcast. I was a man who had seen the storm coming and had built his ark out of common sense and hard work. Years passed, the land healed, and the markets eventually recovered. But the lessons of the 80s were seared into our souls. I continued to farm my 160 acres, my fortress of stone. I never got big. I never got rich. But my land was mine, and I slept soundly every night. One crisp autumn afternoon, long after the world had moved on, my grandson, a boy of 10 with curious eyes, stood with me in the machine shed. He pointed to the old Gleaner F, which now sat in a place of honor, retired from active duty but still kept in perfect running order. "Grandpa," he asked, "why did you keep that old combine? All the other farmers have big new ones now, with computers and GPS. I put my hand on the cool silver metal of the machine, the paint worn smooth by decades of sun and harvest dust. I thought of Frank Bishop's auction, of the fear in the eyes of my neighbors, of the quiet satisfaction of owning something, truly owning it, down to the last bolt. This machine, I told him, my voice thick with memory, is more than just iron and belts. It's a lesson. It taught me that the race doesn't always go to the swift. It taught me that it's better to own a small thing completely than to be owned by a big thing you can't afford. A man's wealth isn't measured by the size of his fields, but by the freedom he has to walk on them. He looked from the simple, honest machine to my face, and I saw in his young eyes that he understood. The land would be his one day, and with it the legacy not of leverage and ambition, but of a quiet, unshakable independence, earned one greasy bolt, one patient repair, and one wise harvest at a time.